As the title of this presentation suggests, we're going to talk about some practical guidelines for negotiators in a school district context. You may be called upon from time to time either to serve on a negotiations team or perhaps even to be the chief spokesperson for a school district. In that event, hopefully this will give you a little insight that will help you navigate the process. So, like most things legal, there are some basic rules to be borne in mind. The first is the separate roles, or concerns the separate roles of the superintendent and the Board of Education. The superintendent is actually the chief negotiator, so to speak, for the school district. In other words, he or she is the individual who is in charge of the process, and some say even is the actual contracting party. Well, that's true to a point, but the point really is that the superintendent is the representative of the district in reaching the contract, and is many times, most times, the signatory to the contract on behalf of the district. Now, that doesn't mean that the Board of Education doesn't have an equally important role. It does. The Board of Education's role is to legislatively approve that contract that is reached between the superintendent and the union involved. And by that, I mean the Board of Education actually implements the contract by appropriating the funds necessary to make that contract an actual reality. Negotiations are conducted using negotiations teams. Negotiation team on the district's part particularly should be staffed with individuals who have particular knowledge concerning the aspects of the negotiation that may play out. For example, if it's a teacher negotiation, it would probably be a good idea for whoever is in charge of the district's instruction and curriculum to be a member of that team. If it's a larger district, for example, with several different buildings, perhaps a principal from the various levels of the organization, elementary, middle, high, or at least one of those levels ought to be represented. One individual that I would suggest should always be involved on the district's team would be a business official. In this day and age, given the amount of money that is involved in negotiating one of these contracts, it's absolutely essential to have a knowledgeable individual on your team with respect to finance. And normally, of course, that would be the district's business official. There are certain subjects of negotiation that a school district must engage in. Those are termed mandatory subjects of negotiation. They have to do with such things as the slide suggests, salaries, wages, hours, agency shop fee, and other things that are terms and conditions of employment. Now, there is another series of topics that can be negotiated about. Those are generally termed non-mandatory or permissive subjects of negotiations. Those are things that a district can negotiate about, but does not have to negotiate about. They are neither mandatory nor are they prohibited. They're just things that are, as the title suggests, permissive. And then the final series of things that should be kept in mind in terms of topics of negotiations are prohibited subjects. Those are matters that cannot be negotiated about as a matter of public policy. One of the most common would be the pension system. The pension system is set by statute, and it is off limits, if you will, as a subject of negotiation. Another common one is the tenure system, the system that is utilized to award tenure. That is the recommendation of the superintendent and the concurrence of the Board of Education. Those two matters cannot be negotiated. And the final basic rule to keep in mind is that negotiations should be conducted in good faith. By that is meant that the parties are obliged to meet at reasonable times and places and to consider one another's proposals with a view toward reaching an agreement. Now, that does not mean that you have to say yes to everything that the other side puts on the table, or that the other side's obliged to say yes to whatever you put on the table. But what you are obliged to do is to do your best to consider those matters, try to accommodate those matters if that is possible, with a view toward reaching a contract at the end of the day. Again, it doesn't require that one say yes to anything, but a good faith effort has to be made to reach yes, if possible. So there are some common assumptions also that accompany the negotiations process, at least some assumptions that I've made over the years, and that perhaps would be ones for you to consider. The first one is that bargaining is not an employer's favorite thing to do. It's something that is imposed on employers, but many employers believe that their time and efforts might be expended better toward accomplishing the mission. I'd suggest that's a little short-sighted. And most employers, once they get into the process and are experienced in the process, don't really regard it in that fashion. Because at the end of the day, the welfare of an employer's employees is very important to the accomplishment of the mission. And that welfare can very well be nurtured through the negotiations process. That's a good way to look at it, I would suggest. The objective, of course, as I indicated before, is a viable, with the emphasis on viable agreement. Not any agreement, but an agreement that will work. The parties are adversaries. The Taylor Law sets up this adversarial relationship, but they're not enemies. The relationship is a long-term relationship, and memories are long. And a long-term relationship will not do very well if one plays fast and loose, if you will, with the negotiations process. Bargaining is a two-way street, and both sides need to understand that. While we certainly are obliged to try and accommodate the association's proposals if we're dealing with an association as opposed to an organization that has some other moniker. But that union on the other side is also obliged to accommodate the district's proposals. It's a two-way street. And finally, there's no magic formula here that applies to every situation. And in fact, I would suggest that every negotiation is unique and ought to be approached with that in mind. So many times at the beginning of negotiations, the union, and many times even the district, is interested in setting ground rules. I have to confess I'm not a big fan of ground rules. There are a couple, however, that I think are important, and in fact, truth be known, there are things that I do whether or not ground rules are formally agreed to or not. In any event, there are no universal rules that are applicable. The parties can set their own rules. The contract may contain some ground rules. Especially if it's a contract with which you haven't dealt with before. It's a good idea in your preparation for negotiations to not only review that contract, but particularly to review it in the context of whether it contains ground rules. Ground rules, if you're going to have them, should be set at the start of the negotiation and not midway through, because then you have issues with respect to whether or not they're going to apply retroactively. And that is a debate that is just really a waste of time if You end up trying to set ground rules in the middle of the stream, so to speak. Anyways, I suggested before, there are two essential ground rules. The first one has to do with dates. At the beginning of every meeting, it's a good idea to set a date or a series of dates for the next meeting or meetings. And the second ground rule that I think is important is that you should have the understanding that any time a tentative agreement is reached during the negotiation, that agreement be reduced to writing and that it be initialed and dated at the time that the agreement is reached. So those are my two essential ground rules. But if the other side particularly is interested in having more, here are a few other useful ground rules that I would suggest. Agreements are tentative. In other words, the negotiations teams may be in agreement, but until such time as the union ratifies the agreement and the Board of Education legislatively approves the agreement, as I described earlier, that contract and those tentative agreements are not binding. Everyone should understand that. Most do, but nonetheless, it's not a bad idea if you're going to have ground rules to make that a ground rule. As I suggested previously with respect to the two ground rules that I consider essential, you should reduce all tentative agreements to writing, and again, don't forget to date them. Any tentative agreement also ought to contain the initials of the chief negotiators. Again, as I suggested with respect to the ground rules I consider to be essential, it's a good idea to set the dates for the next meetings at the start of the meeting that you are at. Another good rule is that negotiations are confidential. In other words, the negotiations teams perhaps are responsible to report back to a limited number of individuals who sent them to the table. For example, your team is going to be responsible to the Board of Education, and the union's team may be responsible to either the president of the union if he or she is not at the table, or perhaps the union executive committee. But all of those folks to whom reports are delivered should understand that the negotiations are confidential and that the reports that they receive should not be circulated beyond the groups to whom reports are given. There should be no publicity with respect to the negotiation, although the rule also can recognize that there are times when publicity is unavoidable, and with respect to those times, it should not be engaged in unless the other side is notified, sometime in advance. Caucuses occur during negotiations, of course, when the individual teams privately discuss their position or perhaps your position. But there should be some limit to the length of caucuses. I don't like to artificially limit caucuses, but if you are going to have a time limit, I would suggest that the time limit be framed in language that permits the other side to extend the caucus on notice to you, so that if you have a 30-minute limit and the other side still needs to continue its caucus, it should be notifying you of the fact at the 30-minute mark that some more time will be needed. And if I were you, I certainly would be agreeable to any reasonable extension of the time, because I like to engage in the notion that the other side is caucusing because it is necessary to the negotiation, and at the end of the day will actually make the process more efficient. Deadlines are not a bad thing in negotiations. So if you're going to have a ground rule concerning deadlines, you certainly a useful one would be to have a negotiation deadline with respect to the declaration of impasse. That's the point at which the parties have exhausted their efforts to reach agreement with respect to all of the proposals that are under consideration. And rather than spinning their wheels, they will engage in this impasse process, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in this presentation. Bargaining during work time. Now, that's something that should probably be avoided where possible, because it seems, at least in my more conservative point of view, that bargaining is not what the employer is paying the employees to do. The employees are being paid to do certain work which is consistent with the employer's mission. But on the other hand, sometimes bargaining, as I mentioned earlier, can be consistent with the mission. And, for example, in circumstances where your own time makes it impossible to bargain off the clock, you may want to, of course, then bargain on the clock because it's consistent with what has to be done to make your job work. Sometimes on the union side, if you're bargaining with an organization that works multiple shifts, those multiple shifts, depending on how the union's team is staffed, could also make it impossible. So that's a circumstance should be considered. Another thing to think about is, all right, if we're going to bargain on the clock, who's going to pay the employees while they're engaged in this process as opposed to the work that they were hired to do? In the public sector, commonly the district will undertake that cost, but there are circumstances in which the union has been asked to share that cost. For example, one way of sharing the cost is that employees have a certain time that's allotted to them under the contract that is many times identified as union leave time. Certainly, I would think if you're going to bargain on the clock, that union leave time needs to be expended for that purpose. Negotiators need to have their own sort of personal set of ground rules. And these aren't going to appear in any formal document that's agreed upon by the parties, but I would suggest that any negotiator should keep certain things in mind in terms of his or her conduct during the negotiations process. The first thing is preparation. Really, a good negotiator's ability is only limited by two things. First is creativity. That may be the most important characteristic of a good negotiator, and the second is being willing to put in the work necessary to be effective at the negotiations table. Preparation. Your personal conduct is important. Remember that when you're at the table, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing your district, and your conduct ought to be consistent with that. Be on time for meetings, for example. Certainly control your emotions. Two of the very critical things. You also need to remember that this is a long-term relationship. When this negotiation is over, the parties are going to have to continue to live and work together. That relationship has to be honored. Don't impugn the other side's motives then in that connection. It doesn't do anything or any good whatsoever to turn an argument into an ad hominem discussion as opposed to a critical look at the idea that is being proposed. You try not to set traps so as to embarrass the other side or to make the other side look or feel as if they're inadequate to the task. If anything, you should be willing to help them because at the end of the day, there still has to be an agreement, and it requires two. Use humor, friendliness, courtesy, whatever works. There's no harm at all in treating people the way you would like to be treated yourself. Try not to use insults. Try not to use threats. They rarely, if ever, result in agreements that turn out to be viable in the long term. Speak softly. If you want to carry a big stick, I suppose, that might be all well and good, but I certainly wouldn't make that stick very apparent. Try not to interrupt folks while they're trying to educate you with respect to their positions. You can certainly expect the same courtesy in return, but you aren't going to get that courtesy if you yourself ignore that rule. Certainly avoiding bad language, that's not what we do in school, and that rule ought to carry over to the bargaining table, even if the folks on the other side do not necessarily adhere to it. Try and make the other guy look good. Especially if you're a chief spokesperson, and it serves no purpose at all for you to embarrass the spokesperson for the other side, because at the end of the day, he or she may be the only person with whom you can caucus with a view toward reaching an ultimate agreement, and your relationship with that individual should be a solid one. Try also not to back the other side into a corner. People who make agreements under coercion and just don't make very good agreements. They're not very thoughtful, and again, in the long term, they won't serve the district very well. One thing to avoid, however, despite all of the notions of treating the other side with respect and courtesy and so forth, and avoid oral understandings. They rarely, over the long term, are remembered accurately, and they don't result in good agreements. As Samuel Goldwyn was once heard to say, an oral contract isn't worth the paper it's written on, and certainly understandings fall into that category. Don't use negotiations meetings for purposes other than negotiations. I was asked some time ago to intervene on behalf of a district in a negotiation where at a prior meeting the district used that meeting in order to serve some papers concerning an adverse decision that was being appealed upon the union. That really did not generate a good atmosphere for the conduct of that negotiation by introducing that collateral topic where the parties really were at odds. Watch for hidden agendas. The rationale for a proposal that you're considering is not always the rationale that's advanced across the table. It's good to be mindful of the fact that the proposal may have an unintended consequence from your perspective, while it may have been the intended consequence from the perspective of the other side. Avoid quickie negotiations. They are a mistake breeder. They're popular. People think that they'll save a lot of time and money by engaging in them. They rarely result in viable agreements, except where the subject matter perhaps is very limited, and perhaps you're only talking about how much money the district is going to spend next year on a contract that's otherwise going to remain unchanged. First of all, quickie negotiators and quickie negotiations result in agreements that don't necessarily give the other side the satisfaction that they need in order to believe that the agreement really is a good agreement for them. And oftentimes your side needs to feel as if it worked for the agreement as well. Quickie negotiations aren't consistent with either of those. When you're at the table, use written proposals and counter proposals. It's not a good practice to use or utilize proposal language which is oral and only consists of concepts, as opposed to a written proposal that consists of language that indicates what you believe the new contract should actually look like. When you prepare a proposal, it's one of the reasons your team is there. You need to review it with your team, because if your team is well constructed, they each will be able to, by reason of their strengths, contribute to your proposal. Avoid arguments, of course. If you use written proposal, it does avoid arguments over what was proposed. It's right there in black and white, and if it's well written, There can't be much argument over what the proposal means. If you can, be the draftsperson. It's good to be able to control language. And in that context, however, you have to be security conscious when you're preparing proposals and when you're caucusing with your team about it. Avoid the open windows, the open doorways, the things that may permit even some third party to overhear and report on what your discussion consists of. Know who's in the next room. Keep as little open on the table as possible. So this is not just applicable in your caucus. It's applicable when you're at the table itself. You don't want your charts and graphs and counter proposals and so forth all out there for everyone to see. A practice that I use is to use a working folder. Now, in that working folder, I'll have negotiations notes, probably only from the last meeting. I won't come to the table with all the notes from the negotiation, but sometimes it's relevant to know what was talked about the last time. Comparative data. It's a good thing to have in your working folder because from time to time it's good to indicate that the proposal that's before you either compares favorably or not so much with what's going on in the rest of the world. Spare copies, yes, because oftentimes it's good to be able to take out a spare copy and write a note on it or something that you can hand across the table that indicates a change in position. So spare copies aren't a bad thing to have in your folder. Certainly in terms of the proposal you've prepared, not only the one that's under discussion, but perhaps the one that you're going to put on the table after the one under discussion has been resolved. Sometimes you want to keep some conference notes in your working folder, particularly if those conference notes resulted in a position that you're prepared to take. But when you leave the room, take your working folder and take your scrap with you. You do not want to be in a situation where the other side picks up a scrap which contains information that you really did not ever intend to convey, or which may in fact even be mistaken by reason of the fact that it's a draft that was perhaps prepared before your team had a chance to talk about it. Number and name confidential reports. It's a very good way to keep track of them, and certainly from a security standpoint, it's important to do that. Avoid denigrating officials on your side. That's another very good personal ground rule that a negotiator should have. There are no secrets in school. If you say that the board or the superintendent just won't listen to reason concerning the matter, believe me, it will get back to the board or the superintendent that you took that position. And it certainly won't make the product of your negotiation something that either the superintendent or the board is going to be willing to consider without looking at it through the lens of someone who has been critical of them. Scheduling meetings. I mentioned that before. It's important to set dates at the outside. In doing that, you want to leave some time to prepare between the meetings. It's not good to have a lot of back-to-back meetings, although that is a rule that perhaps has an exception. I mean, if there is a momentum that has built and you're near the end of the negotiation and you need to push the thing across the line, yes, perhaps back-to-back meetings would be a good thing. But as a rule, try and leave preparation time. Back-to-back, as I suggested, can be useful. But really, again, only in that circumstance where the momentum dictates it. Again, as I indicated before, not only should you be there early, you should try and get your team there early. That's not so you're just ready to go when the clock ticks on the appointed hour for the teams to begin bargaining, but also it gives you the opportunity to review with your teammates what may have happened between the last negotiation and the negotiation you're at that might be relevant to something that's going to be discussed that day. It's a good idea, although not necessarily in a ground rule, but from meeting to meeting to have some notion as to when the meeting is going to adjourn. But again, as the slide suggests, you need to be flexible in that regard, because if there is momentum going on, the last thing you want to do is to run into an artificial adjournment deadline that just stops the process. Providing for amenities is not a bad thing. And by that, to make sure that there's water in the room, or if the parties are so inclined to have a cup of coffee, something like that. Some districts go beyond that and even have things in addition. But otherwise, make sure there's good heat and light and all of the other things that you would think necessary, so the parties are somewhat comfortable in their surrounding. Agenda setting. I believe that every negotiation requires an agenda. Maybe the agendas on the two sides of the table are not always the same, but certainly you, as the district's representative, ought to have an agenda for the meeting. And I often like to contact my opposite number in a negotiation, the chief spokesperson for the other side, and I will try to jointly set an agenda so that both teams are on the same page and the meeting can be productive. But certainly you need to set it, or if you can set it mutually as I suggested, it's a good idea. I would not want to ever suggest, however, that the other side should control the agenda unilaterally. That will not, in the long run, be consistent with what you need to get done for the folks that you're representing. Listening, asking questions, very, very important personal ground rule for a negotiator. Someone once told me you don't learn a thing while you're talking, and that's a very good rule for a negotiator to apply. Review all the proposals that are on the table from the other side, particularly at least once, and I mean review them at the table with the other team. Listen to the rationale for the proposal. Ask questions as to how the proposal will work in given circumstances. It's a key to really having a solid understanding of what the other side really is trying to accomplish. As indicated before, get the why for each proposal. Find out what the problem is. You will often find that a proposal is on the table because it's prompted by some specific situation that the union has encountered in the past. Try and ferret that out, and otherwise also try and get examples as to how their proposal will work in other situations with which perhaps you're familiar with. Find out the constituency that's involved. The other side has folks, just by reason of the democratic nature of unions, that are there in a representative capacity. And they will make proposals on behalf of the folks that they represent. And particularly in a unit that it has a lot of different jobs and descriptions, you'll find that folks will come at specific subjects from different points of view because of that. So find out what the constituency is. I mean, is this a proposal that's prompted by the district's bus drivers? Is it perhaps also the same subject is being proposed on by someone from the clerical part of the organization? Are those different? Why are they different? Can they be resolved, or perhaps can't they be resolved? But those are all good things for you to know. As indicated also previously, don't belittle the other side's proposals. I think you need to, at least until it's demonstrated otherwise, treat the other side's proposal as if they are seriously intended. And that being the case, and just out of respect for the process, try not to belittle that proposal, at least prematurely. Don't over-respond to a proposal that's ridiculous. You have to give some credit to the folks on the other side, being able to engage in logic and reason. And that being the case, if you give a good logical response, the proposal will reveal itself as being ridiculous without your having to say so. The union team actually may not know what it wants, and that's one of the good reasons to probe a little bit, to try and find out, where the various constituencies of the union bargaining team may be coming from. Watch for conflicts, of course, on the other side. You can sometimes use those conflicts to your advantage. Getting the other team to talk, to fill that silence is a very good technique. When the other side states a position, it's also a very good idea to restate that position and watch the expressions of the folks on the other side of the table as you do so, because that too will indicate whether or not there may be conflict between the other team's members. Develop acceptable alternatives. That's that creativity piece that comes to mind. Often a negotiation is resolved because the district is able to develop an alternative which will address the problem that caused the union to make a proposal in the first place, but do so in a way that's actually acceptable to the district. You don't want to settle until the other side's needs are met. A very good mediator at one point told me that one of a negotiator's jobs is to write the other side's acceptance speech. It's victory speech. And there's something to that. You have to recognize that the other side has needs, and they aren't going to be able to settle until those needs are addressed. Some examples. If cost is a problem, split your increases perhaps into multiple years, or have an increase take place at the beginning of one semester and the rest of the increase take place at the beginning of the next. It still addresses the problem. It may not be everything that the union wanted out of the economic proposal, but it's better than saying, no, we can't do it under any circumstances. A buck is not just a buck. The negotiator needs to relay across the table the value of the proposals and the value of those dollars, and how over time those dollars will many times progress geometrically to a much higher number at the end of the day. A welfare trust fund is not necessarily a bad idea. Sometimes, particularly where the union may be dissatisfied with respect to how a particular benefit is being administered, the district can always take the position that, well, let's develop a trust, and the union can administer the trust. The only thing that the district will do is to contribute a fixed amount of money to that trust. Grandfathering is not a bad practice. Again, oftentimes the union will fear that a proposal of the district will take away something, that the employees have often enjoyed. Now, while a two-tiered unit with respect to benefits is not always the best practice in the world, sometimes it's the only way you can go, and the way to do that is to say, well, look, we won't take this benefit away from the folks who were employed as of a given date, but going forward from that date, the benefit will change in the way the district would like to see it change. The use of caucuses. As I mentioned before, caucuses happen and should happen and are a good thing. So what are they for? Well, certainly to get your team's input, not only with respect to where you are at the moment, but where you want to go. To try and anticipate what the other side is going to do. Again, if your team is well composed, it consists of folks that are going to have some insight with respect to where the union is coming from and where they may be going. Certainly to consider the other side's proposals. If you have an active proposal that the union has made and you're caucusing, well, that caucus should be used to solicit the opinions of the folks on your team with respect to that proposal and how that proposal may impact their particular part of the organization. To agree on counter proposals. Okay, we have the union's proposal, we can't agree to it, but what is that acceptable alternative? That should be considered with your team. and your counterproposal really ought to be the product of a team effort. To prepare contract language. Oftentimes the parties have now agreed to something tentatively across the table, and as I suggested, there is a need to put it in writing. Well, soliciting the input of your team in preparing contract language is a very good thing to do. I often will prepare a draft and I'll circulate it around the negotiations table to get the individual views of each member on my negotiations team. Sometimes you use a caucus to stall. It's sometimes important to be able to stall because you may know of some event that is about to take place that is going to change the context of the negotiation. So sometimes you just want to slow down. One way to do that is to use a caucus. Sometimes use a caucus to get the other side to think about what you may have said just before you took that caucus. That there may come a time where you have to draw that proverbial line in the sand and you want the other side to think about it. You draw that line and then you immediately take a caucus so that the other team can consider just exactly where they may be in light of your line in the sand. If you call a caucus, however, normally the ball's in your court. The other side is going to have a reasonable expectation that when you come back to the table, you're going to have something to say. A caucus, however, may break momentum, so you have to be careful from that standpoint. I mean, sometimes if the momentum is not going in a good way, you may want to utilize a caucus to do that, to break the momentum. But usually, if the momentum is going your way, I think the last thing you want to do is to negotiate or to caucus right in the middle of it. Have a proposal ready for the union to consider while you're caucusing on their proposal. It's a very good technique, and it perhaps will take away from the other side caucusing with respect to something that you don't particularly want them to focus on. So better to set their focus by leaving a proposal with them as you take a caucus with respect to the proposal they have just given you. From time to time, folks on negotiations teams may engage in off-the-record discussions or one-on-ones. Trust is very, very important in that context because you certainly don't want that off-the-record discussion to come on back to haunt you later when it shouldn't. Certainly, if you are agreeing or participating in a one-on-one discussion with your opposite number, that too is going to depend a great deal on your having trust in the confidence that the other side is going to keep that one-on-one caucus between the individuals who are involved in it. Now, at the end of the day, however, you need to know that nothing's really entirely off the record. When I have an off-the-record discussion, unless it's a very unusual situation, I will at least report to my team as to what took place during that discussion. I certainly won't report it to anybody else, but my team is entitled to know what is happening even during one-on-one discussions. Of course, the question that you always have to ask, as I indicated before, is do you trust the other individual to keep what is discussed in that one-on-one at least confidential with respect to their entire constituency. In other words, I would not necessarily report a one-on-one discussion to my entire board, while I might report it to my team. And you would certainly hope that the other individual involved is not going to report beyond his or her team to the entire membership of the association, for example. Try not to bargain on the phone. It doesn't produce written copy, and by and large is not a good practice. It doesn't have any witnesses, for example, so it's certainly hard to hold someone to a tentative agreement that's reached over the phone. You are without your team. You don't have the folks whose expertise you might rely on in considering a particular subject. It lacks your ability to see the intangible things, that go on with respect to a person's body language, tone of voice, perhaps. But the body language means an awful lot in the negotiations business, and a good spokesperson is tuned in to those things. Some other techniques that you might be interested in terms of what goes on at the negotiations table. I try to get the other side to go first. I like to know what's on their mind before I reveal what's on ours. If I can get the other side to move twice, that's very, very good. In other words, they make a proposal, you merely say that it's not acceptable and they ought to go back to the drawing board, and then they come back with yet another proposal. Well, they just proposed twice. They moved twice. In effect, you got them to negotiate against themselves. It's a good technique. Packaging. It's I think, well, not always the thing to do. Whenever you can, try and put together packages. In other words, a whole series of proposals of both the districts and the associations that you're trying to resolve, and in the context that if you agree to one of theirs, they've got to agree to one of yours. As I said, it's useful. It's not universal. I mean, every once in a while you'll run into an item that is so complex that it really makes no sense to put it with other items. And for example, if you're changing health insurance carriers and you're talking about coverage issues, you can rarely do that successfully in the context of a large package. You really need to talk about health insurance issues at that point. They're useful, however, because as the slide suggests, if you reject one of theirs, it's a lot easier for them to swallow that if at the same time you make a concession with respect to another one of theirs, or if you withdraw one of your proposals in exchange for their withdrawing one of theirs. Quid pro quo, quid pro quo is exactly what bargaining is all about, and you shouldn't lose sight of that in developing your packages. It's a very good way also, once the negotiation has gotten to what is sort of a tipping point, where both parties realize that you're not going to make a lot of progress if there's a lot of cannon fodder, if you will, in your proposals. So you can use that package to mutually withdraw a whole series of proposals that are seen as proposals that are standing in the way of progress with respect to probably a lot more important proposals. So when you wind up in a negotiation, if you're winding up a meeting, I think it's always a good idea to wind up on your last move, so that when the parties come to the table the next time, the other side's got to lead off. If you're winding up the negotiation, it's a very good technique, if you can pull it off, to settle on the basis of the union's last proposal. Again, as I said before, the other side has to feel as if they earned it, and they can hardly feel that way in a more significant way than if you settle on the basis of their last move. You should certainly try and keep the negotiations rolling, but marathons are also mistake breeders. I've had to do that. I think my record for one session is 54 hours. Sometimes you have to do that. In that particular situation, we were engaged in a very serious strike, and we simply had to get done. And so basically, my team developed the strategy that we were simply going to run the other folks into the ground. And that's what we did. It was necessary. It's certainly, however, not a practice that I would advocate as a general rule. When you reject someone's proposal, your rejection is going to be a lot more credible if you explain why. Now, do you have to explain all of the why? No, but at least have some rationale, some good reason for rejecting the proposal. Because again, as I said before, the proposal's not there for the fun of it. The other side really thinks there's some merit to it. And it's difficult for someone to give up an idea concerning which they think there's merit without some rationale. try never to propose something that your client can't live with. It's tempting sometimes, because you want to get done. But you really will lose ultimate credibility if you propose something and then it turns out at the end of the day that either the superintendent or the Board of Education saying, we'll never settle a contract on this basis, and then they reject it. Well, if you go back to the table next time after that has happened, the other side, I think, can legitimately ask you, what are you doing here? We reached an agreement with you and it couldn't be approved. Why don't you send the people to the table who are able to reach agreements that will be approved? A move to an earlier year is still a move. So if you're negotiating with respect to something that the union wants to happen now, if you're willing to say that, well, we can do that later, or perhaps in a given circumstance, or even if your original proposal was to do something later, you then move to an earlier year with respect to the proposal. That's still a move. And if you're talking about economics, that move to an earlier year can have very serious economic consequences. So a move to an earlier year is still a move. Sometimes you need to get rid of an issue or just have an issue thought about with a little more thoroughness that can be done during the heat of a negotiation. So using a joint committee to solve a complex issue is a very good strategy. And it also sometimes will avoid your having to give up something in order to persuade the union to withdraw something. If you take that union proposal and you have it referred to a committee, you're not going to have to agree to it now. If you do agree, it'll be agreed after some serious thought. And more importantly, you didn't have to give up one of yours in order to get rid of one of theirs. Sometimes you use a committee just to duck an issue. And it may be in the realization that the issue is a hot issue even for the union. And perhaps their negotiations team feels compelled that they have to put it on the table, even though they perhaps might not see the practicality of it themselves. Well, one way to help them out of that kind of a dilemma is to utilize a committee. It'll put the issue off until a later time, and sometimes it never resurfaces at all. Getting other people into the act is not a bad idea at all, especially if the subject matter is going to have an impact on a particular operation. It may be good to get some folks who are really versed in that operation as opposed to the people on the two negotiations teams to give a recommendation back to either the negotiations teams, if the negotiations are still going on, or to the district for future consideration. Certainly you can avoid having one issue which is particularly complex and knotty and perhaps controversial dominate a negotiation if you agree to refer that issue to a committee and then have the parties act on the basis of hopefully a thoughtful recommendation from that committee. Keeping silence is a good technique. I was talking before about filling the silence, that the other side, if you are silent, will often fill that silence with something that you might find useful in terms of moving toward the goals that the district has set. A white knight strategy. That is a strategy that can be used in a circumstance where the negotiations teams are sort of at loggerheads, but that there's really a solution that does come to mind, but might not be as well accepted across the table from parties who perhaps have been wrangling for a while. So a good technique, and oftentimes I'll utilize the superintendent to do this, to have the superintendent come to the table as sort of a special guest to deliver a proposal that will resolve that knotty issue. And if the superintendent has been away from the table during the negotiations, his or her presence will sufficiently change the atmosphere, and if the proposal is delivered thoughtfully, perhaps even resolve and provide a rationale for the union to agree. to something that the district is prepared to live with. Record keeping is very important during negotiations. I mentioned before that's a very good idea to do things in writing. I mean, that's certainly part of your record, and it can help you keep track of where you are in terms of not only your proposals, but also in terms of the notes that you keep on what's going on at the table during the negotiation. At some point, we may have to resolve a dispute concerning what the agreement actually means, either before an arbitrator or in case of some sort of an unfair labor practice allegation that results, of course, in an improper practice charge before the Public Employment Relations Board. In those circumstances, you're in a far better position if you have a better history of what actually went into making that contract language than perhaps the other side does. Negotiations notes, as I mentioned before. Certainly all proposals and counterproposals ought to be accounted for in your notes. I get into the habit of actually using the numbers that are assigned to each proposal in my notes, so I can very quickly just look for the marginal note with respect to which numbered proposal was under discussion, and I can turn right to the rationale that was being advanced at the time. If there's a purpose that is stated, if you manage to get the other side to tell you, and this is why we need this, the answer to that why question, put that in your notes. Later on, especially where someone is trying to suggest that the purpose of the language was to do something else, it's a very good idea to be able to quote back to the union its own very statement of purpose that was made at the time the language was actually proposed and discussed. A definitional statement. If there's a term in the proposal, like, for example, what's a transfer as opposed to what an assignment is? And if the parties had that discussion and defined those terms, and even though those terms didn't make their way into the contract themselves, that the notes of that discussion be absolutely critical in resolving a future dispute. If you can get the other side, or for example, if you put examples on the table, explaining as to how that proposal will work in different contexts. My goodness, make notes of those. Those examples can be absolutely critical in again helping some neutral to try and figure out why the parties put that language in the contract in the first place. I use what are sometimes commonly called caucus time squares. All that is just a little thing that stands out in your notes, and normally I put I guess you could call it a squircle around it because I don't draw perfect squares, but it indicates the time that the caucus started and when the caucus ended. Now, why is that important? Well, if the union is claiming that, oh gosh, we rushed into this and we made some kind of inadvertent error and there never was a meeting of the minds. Well, if you can get out your negotiations notes and show that the caucus started at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and concluded at 5, it's going to be very hard for the union to substantiate that claim in light of the obvious thought that went into a proposal that took 4 hours to resolve. If there is an off-the-record discussion, certainly put it in your notes. Because sometimes if someone tries to attribute to you something that supposedly was said off the record, which actually was never said, it's a good idea to actually have your note as to what was said, so that the neutral will have the advantage of that in determining whether there really was some kind of a side understanding that should influence how contract language is interpreted. A little more on negotiations notes. I would always separate those from your own team's conference notes, because if you get into a dispute, your negotiations notes may be discoverable, not so much with your conference notes, because the neutral is only interested in what is conveyed across the table, not what is discussed in your team's caucus. I sometimes use an arrow or an asterisk to make something stand out in the notes with respect to a promise that we may have made to the other side. In preparing for a negotiation, I'll of course review the notes of the last meeting, and those arrows and asterisks help me to identify promises that I need to keep, or perhaps that have already been kept. But nonetheless, it's a really good device, especially given the time that sometimes elapses between negotiations meetings, during which you may very well have forgotten a promise that was made across the table. If you have correspondence and other material that is relevant to a proposal that is under discussion, you might want to slide that correspondence into your negotiations notes so that the relationship can easily be established. I think you always ought to keep your negotiations notes in chronological order. Keep them in a file. If it helps to bind those negotiations notes into a file in chronological order so that they stay in chronological order, certainly do that. But certainly the oldest should always be on the bottom, at least in my view of the world, and the most recent should always be on the top. You need to find out what's going on away from the table. You may remember I mentioned previously that it's a good idea to get your team there early so that your team members can inform you concerning what has gone on between the negotiations meeting that may be relevant. You need to stay attuned, and you need to suggest to the other folks on your team that they stay attuned to things that may influence the negotiation that don't necessarily take place at the negotiations table. What is the union up to? What have they been doing with respect to the negotiation away from the table? Does the union team have the power to negotiate effectively? Is there a schism within the union that you should know about? You need to stay attuned for those things because, again, you're trying to reach a viable agreement, and the agreement's not going to be viable if the union membership rejects it. Management normally has pipelines, just as the union normally has pipelines into management. We need to pay attention to those pipelines. That's how you learn information that will help you advance your agenda. Union bulletins. Unions are normally very good about distributing bulletins with respect to all of their activities, including negotiations of the membership. Sometimes you can, by getting a hold of those bulletins, receive information that is going to be of benefit with respect to perhaps a motive for a particular proposal that you're finding difficult. In the rare case where you may have a work to rule or a strike being contemplated on the part of the union, even though particularly with respect to the strike it's unlawful activity, don't ignore those things. You need to pay attention to them. If nothing else, even to point out to the other team that you're aware that the activity is going on and that the activity is going to have a deleterious effect of some sort. It's important to pay attention to that and not look the other way. The union sometimes engages in end runs. They will go to your principal. They will go to the superintendent. They will go to the Board of Education with a view toward undermining a position that perhaps you're taking at the negotiations table. Both the superintendent and the board, and I think it's the union's or the district's team's responsibility to do this, they both should be educated to that possibility and to understand that engaging in those sort of away from the table discussions will likely not do very much good in terms of your negotiations team's credibility. You need to know what your guys are up to. I have had the situation where an impatient superintendent or an impatient board member has gone to the union to say that, I can solve this whole thing by doing X. And the union, if it believes that, now has an expectation, which may very well be false. It's not a good thing to do. But you need to also pay attention to things like dismissal and disciplinary proceedings, that may be ongoing at the same time as the negotiations are. Those things will have an impact many times at what goes on at the table. So you need to be paying attention. If there's a layoff that's being contemplated, that too, believe me, will impact what happens at the table, and so you need to be aware about it. You don't want to hear about any of these things when you come to the table one day and simply are confronted with them. Sometimes management does end runs, as I indicated. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you open up a back channel with the union, and it's a coordinated back channel, and by that I mean it's a back channel concerning which the negotiations team has some input, you can sometimes communicate very useful information to the other side that will help them deal with something that's going on at the negotiations table. The uncoordinated back channel is not so good. As I indicated before, if nothing else, it can result in some false expectations being developed on the other side. Many districts, most districts, have more than one union, have more than one negotiating unit. There are some things in that circumstance that you need to think about. One of them is bargaining all those contracts in the same year. Not a particularly good practice. So when you're thinking about what's commonly referred to as the term proposal, which essentially is just how long will the contract last, you need to think about coordinating the expiration of those contract terms so that everybody's not at the table at the same time. The timing of concessions. If you make a concession in one negotiation and you're at the table with another union at the same time, dealing with the same subject concerning which you made the concession, that other union may very well also think that they're entitled to that concession. So how you time those things is very, very important. The timing of settlements. Again, same principle applies. You may settle with one union on terms that the other union might find quite favorable, but inappropriate with respect to their situation. So timing that settlement is important. You often want to, in a multi-unit district, and where you're not bargaining with all of the units at the same time, use one negotiation as a floor, if you will, from which the next negotiation will proceed. And that floor setting needs to be something that you bear in mind as you settle with one union, knowing that you're going to be dealing with another union, perhaps concerning the same issues in a subsequent year. And the last thing with respect to the multi-unit district and why bargaining in the same year is not a good idea, bargaining with all those units, I should say, in the same year is not a good idea, is this last question. I mean, how much disruption can you really tolerate during a given year? Negotiations take time and take resources and sometimes result in morale issues in your district. Even though the morale issue in one unit might rub off on the other, I would suggest it's even worse if you have universal morale problems across all of your units at the same time. Okay, there comes a time in a negotiation, not every negotiation, but in many negotiations, where the parties will just simply reach impasse. And one of the first things that happens when an impasse is reached is required by law and is basically an attempt on the part of the Public Employment Relations Board and the part of PERB to resolve their controversy with the aid of a third-party neutral mediator. Now, the whole topic of mediation is something that is certainly an art form in and of itself. It's a process that is fairly unique to negotiations, and we simply don't have sufficient time now to talk about in detail. But one thing that you want to think about, it seems to me, is to try to avoid declaring impasse if possible. One way to look at it when you declare impasse is that you've given up on the process. That's not necessarily a good thing. But on the other hand, you don't want to shy away from it either, because if the parties literally are spinning their wheels at the table and are not making any progress, and you see no future for the negotiation that will result in a viable agreement, really the best alternative then, if for no other reason to save time and resources, is to declare impasse. So I wouldn't shy away from it. Once the contract is settled, of course, it cannot really come into being as an official agreement that binds the parties until the union has ratified and the board has legislatively approved. Those two things are absolutely critical. Now, in that connection, as a negotiations team member, you have an obligation to support that tentative agreement that you have reached. And if you don't, you will have involved the district in a serious improper practice. Once the contract has been ratified and approved and it's all in place, things come up during the life of the contract that may require negotiations. For example, if the state decides to impose on the parties the obligation to negotiate with respect to performance evaluations, as happened during the APPR implementation, we're going to have to bargain during the life of the contract. When you do that, my suggestion is that whatever agreements result are put in the forms of either a memorandum of agreement or a memorandum of understanding. Now, a memorandum of agreement contemplates that you are actually changing the contractual relationship between the parties, and that often will require the union to ratify again and the board to legislatively approve. A memorandum of understanding, on the other side, is something that doesn't require either of those, but doesn't involve a change in the contract either. What a memorandum of understanding is about is how you implement language that is already in a contract in a given circumstance. So it's good to understand, those distinctions. Some conclusions. Negotiations are inevitable. They're required by law. There is a whole body of case law underlying them, as well as statutory law. You should get your arms around that, embrace that. Negotiations needn't be bad. If they're done well, they won't be bad. Someone once said that negotiations are like dancing. No two people dance the same way. No one situation fits all. You should certainly embrace that as well. It's certainly a good substitute for stones and clubs, which used to be the standard, prior to the days of collective negotiations. There are two secrets I would suggest to being a good negotiator. The first one, as I suggested previously, is preparation. The second one is patience. Besides creativity, which I also mentioned before, probably the single most important attribute of a good negotiator is patience. This is not, of course, as I also indicated before, all there is with respect to this whole topic. But I hope that at the end of the day, what we've talked about thus far will at least equip you to appreciate the process in the circumstance where you might be tapped to represent the district in a negotiation. And finally, one of my favorite sayings, if at first you don't succeed, you'll get a lot of advice. Hopefully, this advice will be a help to all of you as you engage in the negotiations process. Thanks.